Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar on Innovating and Managing Transit in the Era of New Mobility. During each webinar, we take a quick reading on who's joined us, so you'll see a poll pop up now asking which sector best defines you. That'll help our two presenters to get to know who's in the room with us for the webinar today. My name is Jessie Feller-Hahn. I'm Executive Director of Meeting of the Minds. Meeting of the Minds is a global thought leadership network and platform for knowledge sharing with year-round digital and in-person programming. We connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our blog, our monthly webinar series, and more than 20 in-person events each year. Today's webinar is very much a preview into topics and tools that we will be discussing at our 12th Annual Fall Leadership Summit, which convenes this month in Sacramento from November 27 to 29. One of our presenters today, Adrian Piermine, will be with us at the annual summit if you want to continue the conversation with him in person. Registration is still open, but we only have about 5 spaces left. Seriously, 5 spaces. So grab your spot while they're still available. A few housekeeping notes to begin. Because of our very large audience in attendance today, you will remain muted throughout the event. Today's slides and a recording of today's webinar will be available on our website after the event for you to share with colleagues that couldn't make it today. You can also find today's presentation as a PDF in the handout section in the control panel, which you can download already now. It's the very bottom of your control panel, and the slides are also a PDF on the event page for the website, on the website. We will have a Q&A during the second half of the hour, so when you have a question, please type them into the questions panel in your attendee control panel as you think of them. So let's see those poll results pop up. 55% private sector entrepreneur, pretty good. Public sector, almost a quarter. And then a mix of nonprofit, academics, and philanthropy. Nice to know. Thanks for everybody for filling that out. We would appreciate your input regarding today's webinar, so a short survey will pop up when you close your browser at the end of the event. And I'm pleased to introduce our two presenters today. Adrian Piermine is the National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles for DKS Associates. For over 20 years, he has specialized in consulting on transportation technology and smart mobility. Adrian wrote the chapter on connected vehicles for Internet of Things Data Analytics Handbook. He helped coordinate the City of Portland's response to the US DOT Smart Cities Challenge and is co-chair of the Smart Cities Lab, coordinated by the Technology Association of Oregon, which manages the local efforts in the Global Cities Team Challenge. We also have AJ O'Connor, who's the manager of Intelligent Transportation Systems for TriMet, the public transportation agency serving the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area. AJ has been in this role for over 10 years and has led or participated in the deployment of many of TriMet's most innovative and important technologies, including the bus computer-aided dispatch system, the replacement of the voice and data communications for the entire operation, and the new HOP Fast Pass, the smart card fare collection system that has many industry-first elements. With that, let's hear first from Adrian. Adrian, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jessie, for that introduction. I always think it's funny when people say, thanks for the kind words, when really you're just reading a bio that we gave you. So thank you for reading the bios that we gave you. I'm Adrian Piermine with DKS Associates, based here in Portland, Oregon.
And I'm AJ O'Connor, the Manager of Intelligent Transportation Systems at TriMet.
And I'll start us off talking about some general trends that we're seeing in the industry. We've been talking for years. There's been several other webinars and blogs that Meeting the Minds have put on, lots of different publications around innovation in transportation and the disruption that's happening in our mobility space. Whatever language you use, whether you call it 3 revolutions or ACEs or however you want to scramble the acronym of connected, automated, shared, and electric, we're all talking about this convergence of new technologies and new business models that's been disrupting the transportation space. For today, I'm going to focus more on the shared mobility component of all of this and a little bit around mobile technologies, and really with a focus on the TNCs, the transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft. And while I don't love that acronym, TNCs, it's the one that we've kind of settled on as an industry. I might also use ride hailing or ride sharing interspersed here. All means the same thing, really. We're talking about Uber and Lyft and the other TNCs offering those kinds of services. I'm going to be talking more specifically about some of the congestion impacts that we're starting to see in our downtown cores. And I'll be talking about some impacts on transit ridership, and more importantly, what our transit agencies and cities are doing to address these issues. And then AJ, I'll hand the mic over to AJ to really narrowly focus in on what we're doing here in Portland and get further down into the weeds. There's an article that Meeting of the Minds published just last week by Jessica Franklin Hodge, the former Chief Innovation Officer at the City of Boston. The title, Uber's Mobility Dream Might Be a Consumer Nightmare. The topic of this conversation was around this concept of mobility management and the reason that Uber bought Jump Bike and is partnering with Lime Bike and Lime Scooter, partnering and investing in Get Around peer-to-peer mobility, and integrating with and partnering with Masabi to do mobile payments. And it's around this whole concept of mobility management, around Uber owning the relationship with the customer for all of your trip planning and eventually trip purchasing needs, and keeping you on a single platform. And on the one hand, there's a lot of benefit from the convenience standpoint of being able to remove barriers for people and giving them all those options in a single platform. But there's some risks associated with this concept of who ends up being the mobility manager, who ends up owning that relationship with the customer and the citizen. And when you think about some of the equity issues and customer support issues and other things, there's a broader question of whether we want that role to be public sector or private sector. AJ and I aren't going to get into that too much in today's presentation. We're happy to talk about it a little bit more in Q&A if folks want to dig into it. But I wanted to point out this article because it really addresses some related issues to what we're going to be talking about. And Jessica also pointed out in that article that Uber's not the only ones doing this. Lyft is doing the exact same thing with Scooter and Bike and other partners, as well as a number of other private sector players. The traditional auto manufacturers, for example, are getting into this game. So we have a much bigger conversation to unpack around who ends up owning that role in the long run. I'm going to be referencing a couple pieces of work in particular as I go through the next few slides. Bruce Schaller, the former Deputy Commissioner of Transportation in the New York City Department of Transportation, used to, among other things in that role, manage the taxis and the TNCs as TNCs were really emerging in New York City. And that must have been a really challenging role to be in, because the TNCs really did come in out of the blue and disrupt the taxi industry and then increasingly the broader mobility industry. And so Bruce has parlayed that into a very successful consulting career, doing a lot of great research on the pros that come along with those new mobility options and the benefits when it comes to safety and reduction in drunk driving and some of these other issues, but also the cons of what it's doing from a congestion standpoint with the policies that we currently have in place, and a lot of work around what we should be doing to address this more in the future. So I'll be referencing a little bit of work from the Schaller work. And then Dr. Susan Shaheen and the team down at UC Berkeley, Transportation Sustainability Research Center, have been doing a lot of work over the last several years on innovation and disruption in transportation. And I'll be using some of their work to talk about the impacts that we're seeing on transit. So Schaller's report was heavily focused on our 8 major metropolitan centers and what we're seeing in terms of impacts from the TNCs on our urban downtown core in particular. And I'm going to focus on San Francisco as kind of the TNC capital of the North America anyway. The graphic that you see on the left is showing concentration of drop-offs from Uber and Lyft. And those that are familiar with downtown San Francisco know that top right corner where we see the darker colors of the higher concentration on an average Friday of TNC drop-offs, that's the financial district. That's the real downtown urban core of San Francisco, which makes a lot of sense. If that's where the people are, that's where the trips are. But what does that do to mobility? What does that do to congestion in the downtown where we're still operating our right-of-way, operating our infrastructure the way we have traditionally? And there's mostly street parking on the sides of the road, So the TNCs don't have places for quick access for pickup and drop off, and they don't have places to park and queue up and wait for consumers to hail the ride. And so what do? They end up driving around in circles around the downtown core waiting for that ride to be hailed. And then when there is a pickup or a drop off called, they often have to double park. And so not only is that further exacerbating the congestion impact, it's also decreasing safety in that downtown core. So we have a number of issues. And on the city side of things, we're going to need to be looking over the next few years on how we manage our assets, how we manage our curb and right of way. We're not going to be talking too much more about that today. We're going to be focusing more on the transit side. But San Francisco, as we were getting ready for this presentation, I came across this really valuable tool that the San Francisco County Transportation Authority has built. It's an interactive web portal that allows you to go in and see what the impacts to congestion over the last, I shouldn't say last 6 years, from the data that they used on this tool is from 2010 to 2016. And they look at congestion using some different metrics, the vehicle hours of delay, vehicle miles traveled, or speed. You see that in the top right corner. You can select on which one of those. I'm focusing on vehicle hours of delay because I think from a consumer or citizen standpoint, that's what we think of when we think about congestion. So you click on a particular segment of road and you can see the different factors that impact congestion. You see the green box where the San Francisco County Transportation Authority looks at things called the network effect, population effect, employment effect, and TNC effect. Network effect means anything that the city's done to the roadway, like add a bike lane or take away a traffic lane or something else that they've done physically to the network that would affect congestion along there. Population and employment are pretty much exactly what they sound like. Has there been an increase in population in this part of town or decrease, increase or decrease in employment that would affect congestion? And then TNC is what is the impact from the TNCs. And so the particular network segment that I selected in this slide had a 540% increase in vehicle hours of delay between 2010 and 2016. And if you look at the pie chart on the lower right-hand corner, you see that TNCs were the major factor influencing or impacting that level of increase in congestion. So another interesting point in the Schaller report is that Bruce Schaller predicts that this year, 2018, is going to be the tipping point year where TNC and taxi combined ridership or trips surpass our bus ridership combined across the whole country. That's a pretty major milestone. The other thing that jumps off the page at me when I look at this table is just the drastic increase in percentage of the trips that are TNC based. And you look year over year from 2017 to 2018, that level of growth, and you look at over the last 6 years from 2012, where the TNCs accounted for such a small percentage of the trips, to now just 6 years later. And so just imagine that trend continuing and what that's going to do to our downtown core. And then as I go into the next set of slides, we'll be talking about the similar impacts on transit. But I didn't want this presentation to sound like I'm beating up on the TNCs specifically. That's not the point of this. And to support that, when that Schaller report came out, and a lot of different media outlets picked up on it and wrote a bunch of articles that made it sound like that was the point of the article, Robin Chase, the former CEO of Zipcar, wrote a very important article for CityLab titled, "If Your Car is Stuck in Traffic, It's Not Uber and Lyft's Fault." And the point that Robin was making that I wholeheartedly agree with is that it's the private vehicle is still the major reason that we have congestion in our towns. And so she looked at a different data set, really looking across the country at all of our cities that have rail as an option, like we have here in Portland with TriMet and the light rail Max, that in those cities that even have rail as an option, still 85% of the trips are private vehicle, whereas less than 2% are in taxi and rideshare. So it's an important point to make. So I'm going to switch gears into impacts on transit, the work from Dr. Shaheen and the group down at UC Berkeley. This data is from our National Transit Database. And you can see that from 2015 to 2016, just one year over year report from our National Transit Database. Of our top 30 transit agencies, the vast majority of them, over 80%, actually saw a decrease in ridership over that 1 year span. And the small few that had an increase in ridership, most was very, very small nominal amount of increase in ridership. The only exception on this whole table is Seattle, who has made a very significant investment as a city and as a region in public transportation, both the city and the transit side of things. But everybody else saw either very little increase, and the vast majority saw decreases in transit ridership, including some very high numbers when you get down to the bottom of the list. Those are significant drops in ridership. And it's important to note that TNCs are certainly not the only cause in that ridership going down. There's a number of different factors. But if you look through the rest of Dr. Shaheen's work, there's a number of studies that are cited that show that TNCs in different geographies are taking most of their trips from taxi and increasingly many of their trips from transit, especially in cities like Boston and San Francisco and other ones that are generally well served by public transportation, that the trips are coming from transit and going on to TNCs. So the question is, what do we do about it? How are our transit agencies going to morph into this new era of mobility and partner with these firms and become part of the new ecosystem of mobility? And so we're seeing national trends in transit working together with their cities and other partners, and a combination of infrastructure investment, and where we really need to focus a lot is going to be on policy change. You know, when I was talking about the downtown San Francisco example, policy is going to need to dictate a lot of what's going on here. There's physical places where we can work together, the concept of mobility hubs, and technical places like the concept of mobility as a service. I'll talk about them briefly here, and then AJ can talk more in the weeds, specifically with what we're doing in Portland. And when we do look at this working together and partnering on infrastructure and investment, what we're seeing nationally is a focus on corridors, on high capacity service corridors, improving frequency and speed, and potentially the most important bullet here is the reliability of the network. If people can rely that there will be a bus, a high capacity bus every few minutes on this corridor, they're far more likely to make that transit trip. The concept of the mobility hub is the physical space where light rail or a bus rapid transit or some other high capacity transit can bring people to this physical space, and there is a transfer point to a number of different modal choices for that last mile, whether it's a bike share option, TNC, ride share option, car share option with a car to go or something like that, Zipcar. Mobility as a service is sort of the technical equivalent to the mobility hub concept. The application in your hand that allows you to look at transit and first and last mile connections, and the back office solutions that allow you to plan that trip from point A to point B across multiple modes. The dream of mobility as a service is that we can pick our trip starting at point A and ending at point B and look at all of the different options available, transit, bike share, car share, and pick the one that makes the most sense for us today, based on the criteria that we want today, whether it's price or time, and push a single button and say purchase. But we're still a long way from true full service mobility as a service. And so at this point, I think I'll hand it over, AJ, and let you talk about what we're doing locally here in Portland on these issues.
All right. So as Adrian mentioned, the world is changing very rapidly, and TriMet is relatively well positioned to be able to adapt quickly. We have a long history of collaboration with regional partners and private entities, and we have a history of collecting data and putting systems in place that position us well for this changing environment. And what I want to talk about is a little bit of the history, some of our foundational systems that have put us in a position where we can adapt, and some systems that we are currently working on in putting in place. To start with, sort of one of the foundational items is a CAD AVL system, or a bus dispatch system. We were one of the first agencies in the early 80s to put a system in place. At that time, these systems were in their infancy, and the data structures and databases delivered from the vendors were fairly non-existent. TriMet created a database, and in conjunction with our first vendor, and created basically data structures that allowed the data to be passed between scheduling systems down to customer information systems, etc. And that collaboration provided the foundation for what is now known as the General Transit feed spec. It was originally called the Google Transit feed spec because that is where it started. Google was working with one of my colleagues, Bibiana McHugh and Tim McHugh, and working on how they could improve the data and open up the data that we were collecting from our CAD to be used for other systems and possibly as a model across other transit agencies. And that work has now gone across the world and is used everywhere, and was sort of TriMet's first commitment, if you will, to open data and open transit. Later, we changed our CAD AVL vendor, and that's where we first encountered Adrian as a consultant and started working with us when we replaced that CAD system. We improved it and collected the data. And why is that important? Because without the data, we can't ensure that we have reliable service. We can't find where we have problems. So having a good system that allows us to collect that data for post-operational analysis and for real-time managing the system is key. So the slides you see in front of you are two examples of how we have immediately tried to address the reliability of our system. On the left, you see a bus-only lane and a bike lane that wasn't there just a few weeks ago. We had identified that particular spot as an area that was causing delays in our service on that street and a street adjacent to it going the other direction. And with some simple changes like striping and the signs that you see, we were able to reduce the delays by 12% in that area. That wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have the data available to do that kind of analysis. In addition, with the changing demographics as the baby boom has begun to retire, TriMet is absorbing hundreds of new operators who aren't familiar with our streets, who aren't familiar with driving a 40-foot bus. And we were having an enormous number of off routes. And it isn't just simply going off route and then coming back that's causing problems with reliability. It's turning onto a street that you can't move a 40-foot bus on and it gets stuck. So with our CAD system, we were able to add the module that you see on the right, which is what our operators see. It's a turn-by-turn direction system, very similar to TomTom, that allows operators to get audible alerts on when their route is changing so they don't go off route. This has only been in place for about 2 months, but already we've seen almost 30% reduction in off routes. So those are two immediate things we're doing to make sure that our service for our high occupancy vehicles is as frequent and reliable as possible. And here's just an example of all the data that we have been able to collect, allows us to look at where our service is having reliability problems and where we can focus long-term and short-term solutions. I'll talk about the long-term ones later. Those were just two examples of sort of short-term solutions. So we have other systems in place that are collecting data that is going to be crucial for this new future. This you're seeing right here is our HOP FastPass system. HOP is an account-based regional fare collection system that has industry-leading features like stored value, fare capping, open payments, open APIs, and virtualized smart cards. Once again, we partnered with Google and Movable and Init, which is the CAD vendor as well, to create this virtualized card that allows customers with an Android phone and an NFC-enabled Android phone to tap and pay. That's what you see on the right. What you see on the left is our Hop Fast Pass card that is integrated to a retail network, very much like buying a gift card. You can buy it at any 7-Eleven or grocery store, and you can tap and go. And one of the advantages of this over a lot of systems prior to it is it's account-based, and we pushed open APIs. When we put the RFP out, there really wasn't an account-based open API system out there. Init had, prior to this, not really been in the fare industry, and we took a risk with them, and it has paid off in a very, very big way. Because why is this important to the changing environment? Because we now have a flexible, open architecture for fare payment that can be expanded to all the other modes that Adrian was referencing. We're in talks to allow bike sharing to be paid through this, bike lockers, scooters, etc. Another fundamental piece of system here within TriMet is the Open Trip Planner. So the same colleague I referenced earlier that was instrumental in the creation of the General Transit Feed Spec, Bibiana McHugh, has led this effort to create an open trip planner that allows our customers to plan door-to-door itineraries that integrate with Car2Go, Biketown, Lyft, Uber, and Zipcar. So, as Adrian said, we don't want a world dominated by Uber where all your mobility is managed through an Uber or a Lyft. But that doesn't mean that we see them as, as he said, evil. We agree with that. We want to partner with them and be part of the solution. And this gives us an example where we are doing that at least in the planning of the itineraries. This is going to be released to beta testing in December. And what we hope to do later is, as Adrian had shown with the evolution of shared use mobility, is then extend this and add the ability to not only plan your itinerary, but pay for your whole trip. So I'm going to start talking about projects that are not fully in place, but are funded or will soon be funded. Next generation transit signal priority. This is a very busy slide. But also back in the early 80s, TriMet was one of the very first transit agencies to institute a transit signal priority system. So TriMet installed an infrared emitter on our buses and integrated that with the CAD-AVL system so that when a bus was behind schedule, it would emit a signal that would be received by a device that was hung on the traffic signal light. And that traffic signal light would receive that request to grant priority to the bus, which means extending the green if the light was green already, or shortening the red so that bus could get through the intersection faster. It's pretty rudimentary now, 20 years later. All it knows is that bus is late and that it's on this route and it's requesting a priority. The current system does not know anything like passenger load, the relation of the bus to other buses. And so TriMet is going to invest, hopefully with grant funds from the federal government, and if not our own funds, in a next generation transit signal priority system. The key difference is you don't have to put emitter or devices on the traffic poles to receive that signal anymore. This new system would basically take all the information that we know about that bus, how many people are on it, where it's going, what its relationship to other buses are, and pass that information to a system that can request priority based on all those different factors and send that to the traffic signal control central system, which passes it to the signal. So this is all about making high occupancy vehicles move through the congested areas faster than your Uber and Lyft that have one or two people in it. We're hoping that we'll have that project underway in a year. Route, or rail operations optimization technology, is another project that is a little further along than the next gen traffic signal priority. We actually are piloting this on 4 light rail vehicles, and essentially everything that I mentioned about the CAD-AVL system on the bus is virtually non-existent on our light rail vehicles. We don't know where our light rail vehicles are to the same level of granularity as the bus. We don't know how many passengers in real time are on that vehicle to the same level that we do the bus. That's because train tracking in a lot of areas in the U.S. is still reliant on field technology that was designed to prevent trains from running into each other. And so they only care about that the train is in this block of area and not allowing it to go forward into another block where another train sits. So what we're attempting to do is bring the train up to the level of the bus by putting a hardened PC on that train and being able to provide the functionality that you see listed on the left. This graphic is showing where we want to go once we have everything in place. As Adrian said, the dream is to not just plan your itinerary for mobility, but actually pay for it and move forward. And we're working right now with several private companies and government agencies to move this forward. Lastly, we are looking forward to the future, and we're working with our regional partners, our MPO, the city, and consultants to identify specific corridors where we know we want to move high occupancy vehicles through as fast as possible. And we have developed a plan on what we would do in terms of capital projects, where it's not just simply restriping or putting a software overlay that allows buses to get through faster, but things where we actually have to change the streets and make some investments. In addition, we've also worked with Nelson Nygaard to strategize on what can we do from a physical standpoint to change some of our existing transit centers so that they are those mobility hubs that Adrian was describing. So not only will you be able to plan your service on your mobile device and book and pay, but it'll be there all in one place when you get off of your particular mode. And we're looking at doing this at the Tiger Transit Center, which would be part of a new light rail extension that will hopefully be coming in the next couple of years. And lastly, this is from the City of Portland and a Central City Motion Plan. This is all about showing what we really want to do, which is have high occupancy vehicles moving as many people through our congested areas as quickly and as efficiently as we can. And that to make all this happen, we need to ensure that we're collecting all the data that we need to be able to identify the trouble spots, collect the data that allows us to manage the real-time service to as near perfect as possible, and then to be able to share that data via open APIs. For example, all our data on our systems real-time is available on our website. You can subscribe to the service. We've embraced open data and certainly don't feel like that we have all the answers, and that's why we've made the data available to anybody that wants to access it. And I think we're just about out of time. So I think
Great. Thanks, AJ. Yeah, thanks, AJ. Thanks, Adrian. So we're going to move now into Q&A with Adrian and AJ. So if you have a question, you can type them into your questions panel and your control panel on the right, and we have a few that have already come in, obviously. So we're going to start with those. And quick question for AJ on TriMet. Is TriMet monetizing the referrals coming through your integrated trip planner to providers like Uber, Car2Go, and Lyft?
For the actual planning of the itinerary, we have not monetized that to date.
Great. Good. Perfect. Let's see. Courtney wants to know, what was the ROW acronym? What did that stand for? I think that was for you, AJ.
Oh, back on the slide, probably Rightofway.
Great. Perfect. Just to clarify that, thanks. Okay, Marquetta is wondering, for you, I think this is for you, AJ, but Adrian, you can also think about an answer to this. First to AJ, which specific industry partnerships and pilots do you have currently underway? I guess you talked about some of them, but are there any others you want to touch on?
We have the pilot with the Route project, and I don't think it's not secret. It's with Siemens, our car manufacturer. That's one pilot that we have underway. The next generation TSP system, we're in the RFP stages on that, so we don't really have a pilot underway with that. And I'm trying to think if there's any others that we have.
So we're in early stages of exploring a partnership with a technology company around safe and smart bus stops, but it's too premature right now to announce that partnership. It'll just be in the coming weeks, so you can look for it. That should be a pretty big one once we're able to announce that. And then, of course, all of the different partnerships with Google and Visa and Apple Pay that AJ mentioned with the Hopcart implementation were really first of their kind in transit for payment. And we're
one correction, not Apple Pay.
Oh, sorry, sorry. Google, yeah, Android. The trip planner, the GTFS spec, TriMet's also continuing to work with the industry to expand that specification into the share model and trying to expand it into rideshare, flex services, and car share data providing in the same way that they created the first standard for transit. So that's continuing. I think that's probably about it.
Okay, great. And a follow-up question on that. Do you guys have any lessons learned from the pilots? Anything you've learned to take through to the next pilot to improve it or build efficiencies, or any failures you're willing to talk about?
I don't know about which pilot the question was specifically referring to, but I think in general, we're not afraid to fail here. I didn't mention it, but in the early 80s, we had an absolute horrendous failure with a sort of self-service ticketing system that we learned a lot from, and we took those lessons and made sure we didn't repeat them when we went out to bid for our HOP Fast Pass account-based fare collection system. I guess just the short message is be prepared to fail and try and fail quickly.
The reason that TriMet is embracing the pilot and demonstration model and the unsolicited proposal model is that they recognize that with a lot of this new evolving technology, the traditional procurement model that they normally have to use to buy a section of rail or a bus is too slow of a process to keep up with the pace of technology and innovation. The idea of putting out one RFP to select a consultant, having that consultant write the functional and technical requirements of a system, put out another RFP, get a vendor, go through negotiations process. By the time you get that second vendor with the technology solution under contract and start to finally build it, from the time you had the concept of what you wanted to build till the contract with the vendor can be anywhere from 1.5 to 3+ years just to start building the piece of technology that you were thinking about a couple of years ago. So that doesn't keep pace with innovation. And so we need to do more of these kinds of pilots and demonstrations. The challenge with it is the nice thing about having a spec or a tight RFP is that you have a contract to then hold that vendor accountable to. And so when you're going into pilots and demonstrations and you don't have the specific clear roadmap, what you need to do is understand your use cases that you're trying to achieve and be really clear with the concept of operations and the use cases. And then you have at least something to hold the vendor accountable to whether this is a successful pilot or not. I think that's probably the biggest lesson learned is it's not going to be, the contract isn't going to be an airtight set of specifications or requirements, but it needs to be a real crystal clear set of use cases that you're comparing their technology against.
Great. Thanks for that. Richard Lechner, hi Richard. He's wondering first maybe over to AJ and then Adrian, how do autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles fit into your vision? You want to talk a little bit about AVs and then Adrian chime in after AJ?
Sure. AV is definitely on TriMet's radar for bus and light rail. And that is one pilot that I did not mention because it's really not concrete yet. I'll just say that we have received an unsolicited proposal. So to Adrian's point about procurement, what's been happening is TriMet has an unsolicited proposal policy where anybody can basically submit a proposal for a pilot or for a project to TriMet without TriMet having issued an RFP or an RFI. And TriMet will evaluate that, and then if we are interested, we'll publish that unsolicited proposal for 30 days and see if we get anybody else, and then we can start the pilot if we don't. In that process, we did receive a specific proposal to start piloting an autonomous light rail vehicle, and we're exploring that. At the same time, we're also exploring autonomous buses. So I don't know if that was the question, that the emphasis was on what TriMet is doing in terms of autonomous or how TriMet is going to evolve with autonomous personal vehicles. In regards to
I think both, yeah.
Both, okay. In regards to autonomous personal vehicles, it's very much like what Adrian was saying about Uber and Lyft. It doesn't help congestion if everybody's just sitting in their own personal autonomous vehicle going around the city, and then when you drop off, the autonomous vehicle just drives around or goes parks somewhere. So TriMet, philosophically, I don't think this is in any policy document yet, but philosophically, I think TriMet and the city of Portland and the region here is still very committed to trying to promote and prioritize high occupancy vehicles on frequent service routes, whether that's light rail vehicles or that's buses.
So I'll start with the connected vehicle part of it because that's kind of more of the near-term opportunity and implementation. When we're talking about transit signal priority, there's two pieces of the architecture that TriMet's looking at. System-wide, the architecture would be a vehicle to center where the bus is talking back to TriMet's operations center and saying, I am here, I am on this corridor, I am requesting transit signal priority. And the central system says, oh, you are in City of Beaverton on this street approaching this signal, and send the request from the central system out to that signal. That network could be overlaid with a localized connected vehicle component too, where the bus is talking directly over connected vehicle technology to that intersection. It's not instead of the vehicle to center and center to field, but it's overlaid on top of that. So the idea there is that right there at the local level, the bus is talking in the intersection saying, I'm requesting, my central system's already put in a request to you, but I am right here. And that intersection also knows that there's a fire truck coming or pedestrians, still in the crosswalk or whatever it knows that's happening locally, and can help make those decisions and even communicate back to the bus. So we would potentially look at piloting, demonstrating some connected vehicle technology on the buses. We're also looking at connected vehicle technology for the next generation rail. We're wanting to we've got a corridor that's going to have bus and rail and even occasionally vehicle traffic all in the same section of roadway sometimes. And needing to improve our headways on that corridor, we're going to need to be able to have vehicles communicating with one another and communicating with infrastructure, because right now we have to set the headways much further apart due to safety issues around rail than what we'll be able to, or what we're really going to need to get throughput on some of those corridors. So we're looking at connected vehicle technologies for both bus and rail in the not too distant future. The only other thing I'll add on the autonomous shuttle part of it is, I think TriMet and most transit agencies know that over the coming decade or more, gone will be the empty 40-person bus driving around neighborhoods on the edges of our town. And we're expecting that to be replaced with 10 and 12 whatever person shuttles, increasingly probably connected and then automated shuttles that are doing sort of that first last mile feeder service out in our neighborhoods. And whether those autonomous smaller shuttles are operated by TriMet or private sector, that will evolve over time. But I think that's the only other connection I'd say into the AV world.
Great. Perfect. Thanks for that. I'm going to move. Lots of questions coming in. Thanks, everybody. It's an interesting question, though, around urban air mobility. Adrian, to you first, then to AJ. Do you see urban air mobility as more of a solution or a challenge to a lot of the issues that were mentioned during the presentation today, congestion, et cetera? And to AJ, have you thought about has TriMet thought about how the current plans for flying air taxis can be integrated into current open trip plan or any of the other initiatives? So over to you first, maybe, Adrian.
I'm pretty excited about the potential of urban air as helping us solve a lot of these problems. Certainly the downtown congestion problems that I was talking about at the beginning, the more you can go away from the grade, and it's getting increasingly expensive to go under the grade. So above the grade is an option in the future. I think it can potentially help with downtown congestion. I still think we're quite a few years away from seeing that on any sort of real deployment scale here in North America. I think we're going to start to see it in countries that have a lot more, where the government has much more control over just being able to deploy things due to their government structure. I think we're still quite a ways away. So I'd say realistically, we have not been considering the urban air layer with our multimodal planning for the near term here in Portland.
And then specifically to TriMet's response, we specifically haven't addressed air, but our response in general is that the data matters, the data and the open architecture, so that you can plug in any new mode as long as it's collecting and sending the same data feed into our systems and we can communicate back out. So, for example, the city of Portland is just about to conclude a test of scooters that's been operating for, 4 months. And one of the requirements that we worked with the city was we need the data in a certain format from those scooters on where they are and what they're doing. And as long as we have an open architecture and we agree on data formats, we can absorb and add new modes that maybe we haven't even thought about yet or planned for. That's the whole point of an open architecture, open APIs, is it gives you that flexibility to adjust when something you haven't thought about pops in.
And one last thing I will say about the urban air concept. I mean, to a lot of people, this sounds like science fiction that's still decades and decades away. But for those of us that go to a lot of these conferences and see what's happening, there's a lot of these technologies are far more real and near term than most people realize. And there's stuff going on in the Middle East and other places that I think would people would be shocked that they think is decades away that's happening within the next year or two. So I didn't mean at all for that to sound like I don't think it's something we should be considering. I think it's going to happen a lot faster than most people realize.
Right. And there's also a cluster of startups in Silicon Valley and VCs solely dedicated to urban air mobility. So it's happening. Yep. Great. So Caitlin Cooper is wondering, just shifting to behavior with TNCs. First to you, AJ. In terms of policies, have you guys explored economic incentives or disincentives to motivate users to use TNCs as a complement to transit and not a replacement, maybe first and last mile or first to three or last 3 mile initiatives or pilots?
Yes, we are exploring that, and we are internally talking about that. Probably the most concrete example of that right now is our Paratransit service is by far our most expensive service to provide. It's about $45 a ride, and we're looking to partner with TNCs where possible to offload some of those rides. Right now, if we don't have capacity or we have a breakdown, we'll often just offload them to a cab company, and we're looking at expanding that to the TNCs. That's probably the most concrete example that's further along in terms of partnering. But as a general concept, yes, we are, like I said, we're not, our general manager likes to use the analogy of a pirate's life, that sometimes you cooperate with other pirates in attacking a ship, and then other times you're fighting that same pirate ship. And that's the analogy he likes to use for our relationship with the TNCs. And I think it's fairly accurate. We definitely want to work with them where it makes sense, but we don't want to just hand them over the entire business.
Great. Adrian, anything to add, or other cities you've worked in and models you're seeing for the first and last mile partnering with TNCs?
We've seen a lot of pilots around the country with first and last mile with TNCs, and it's a perfect example of where I want to come back to AJ's comment of not being afraid to quote unquote fail, because one of the reasons that we do pilots is to learn what elements of it work and what elements of it don't, so that if we want to go from pilot phase into some broader demonstration, what do we improve and tweak to make that more effective? And if we want to go from demonstration into full deployment, what do we improve and tweak? And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of the pilots, the metrics that people use traditionally around ridership counts would make these pilots in many cases look like failures. And I just want to encourage people to still consider pilots and not look at those and say, because this failed by our ridership standpoint, clearly this is a path we shouldn't go down. I think the point of pilots is to say what part was successful. And so there's cases like in Denver RTD where they piloted with Lyft for last mile connections into another transit center. There's cases down VTA in Silicon Valley where they partnered with some of the TNCs, and the ridership numbers were low, but that's not the point of doing a pilot, I guess, is the point I want to make.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, not specifically about a pilot, but in general, transit agencies are beginning to adapt to the idea that, we're, like I said, we're not in competition. The whole point is to be able to move people around your region. And if a TNC can do it more efficiently and more cost effective in certain scenarios, then we should embrace that. We shouldn't try and stop them at every single area. We shouldn't forget that our mission is to move people as efficiently and effectively for the betterment of everybody.
Yeah, and so the equity piece of that is the other critical component. And so when I was looking at the ridership numbers, one of the other takeaways from decreasing ridership in transit might also be that this isn't the only metric that we should be comparing transit to and success. It's really about equitable, affordable mobility options for everybody in your region. That's the metric.
Perfect. Thanks, Adrian. That's a perfect segue into I think we have 2 or 3 questions about equity. Excuse me, AJ, maybe to you first. Has the planning process for the transit system taken into account issues of socioeconomic inequality, e.g., digital divide, or potential for subsidized transit for low-income users? The other question, and I'm going to pair it just quickly, is from Ann Marcus, who lives in Portland. Hi, Ann. How does transportation planning models balance the needs, preferences of high productivity sectors with low-income disadvantaged sectors and reflect that in the types of transportation option mixes? And what plans are in place to incentivize travelers traditionally wed to individual vehicle transportation to use high occupancy vehicle options? So combining those questions a little, I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, AJ.
Okay, you'll have to repeat the second question later, but I'll give an answer. And then, so specifically, yes, absolutely. TriMet is very focused and very committed to equitable transportation. And the example that pops into my mind is the HOP Fast Pass system. From the very beginnings of that project, equity was taken into account. In other words, if we were going to start moving away from paper tickets, how do we make sure that socioeconomic disadvantaged neighborhoods are not effective? And the way we addressed that was we looked at a retail network, like I had mentioned about the gift cards. Can we make those cards available for sale and reload at a retail network that has high penetration into all areas of TriMet, not just the downtown core or where the rich live? And so that has been a big success. We've been able to do that. In addition to that, because of the architecture of the electronic fare system in the back end that we have developed in it, we were able to respond with a low-income fare program. Excuse me, I think we've changed the name from low-income fare to transit assistant program, where for those that qualify, they can purchase transit at a lower rate than when they need to. So those are the 2 things that we've done specifically in regards to the systems that I have described. But I can tell you, as a general philosophy, equity is very important to TriMet, and it is involved in all our planning. And Adrian can certainly speak to the challenge that the City of Portland and TriMet participated in. And although we didn't win, one of the central themes of our pitch to the federal government was around equity. And we have done studies on mobile phone penetration or smartphone penetration and have found that is really, it penetrates into all socioeconomic areas. So the ability to provide applications like mobility as a service where you can, our open trip planner, where you can plan your trip on your phone, anything that you can do on a smartphone and be able to use that to access transit, definitely has penetration into the lower socioeconomic groups.
So just real quickly, the challenge that AJ was referring to was, as you mentioned, Vector, in my bio, Portland's response to the U.S. Department of Transportation Smart Cities Challenge a few years ago, the $50 million winner-take-all project that went to Columbus, Ohio. Our whole pitch had two primary components. One was a central marketplace for mobility that really was the kernel of the mobility on demand sandbox. When AJ put that slide up earlier, that is now a Federal Transit Administration program. The MOD Sandbox is a FTA funded program that is really building out for us the central piece of what was our response in the Smart Cities Challenge. And that was an ubiquitous mobility for all marketplace. And the other focus was anywhere where we are investing in infrastructure and our corridors, it was in communities and corridors that have traditionally been underserved and underinvested in the past. And what I've seen from TriMet is all of their planning, whether it's technology planning or even just service planning, has an equity lens to it. And equity means a lot more than just the color of somebody's skin or the language that they speak here. And so there's socioeconomic, there's financial, there is language spoken, there is minority, and all of these factors are overlaid to identify the different communities, and every investment decision that they now make with the equity focus. So.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, you guys. We didn't get to all the questions, but I'm happy to say that Adrian has volunteered to answer some of your questions in a follow-up blog post. So look for that. We will email that out in our daily email of the day with the blog post of the day. So check that out when that comes out.
And can I sorry to interrupt, but can I add that I'm willing to answer questions too if there's anything specific to TriMet.
Perfect. And AJ too. Didn't want to throw you under the bus, AJ, but you guys are on. You guys are on now. We have a lot of questions we didn't get to. A lot of good questions around low technology approaches, more rural, suburban environments, data, land use, neighborhood design. So there's some good ones for the blog post. So we will just we have to wrap up because we're at the top of the hour. But a short survey will pop up when you close your browser, and really appreciate your feedback. We hope to see you at next month. Actually, next month we're skipping December, but we will have a webinar in January. Hope to see you on our blog at one of many of our upcoming events around North America. There will be we have meetups in San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Portland, and Sacramento. So check out our website for those to meet Adrian and others in Portland in January, and his colleagues in Seattle and other interesting folks, like-minded folks working on the future of sustainable and smart cities. All information is available at meetingoftheminds.org. And that concludes our session for today. Thank you so much, Adrian and AJ, for your work on this and your time today and insights.
All right. Thank
you.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Have